Okay, so today, as Marcin said, we're going to talk about using Umbraco development and mobile app development and how the two can combine. So this is actually something from personal experience. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Emma Garland. I'm a senior software engineer at Rock Solid Knowledge. We're Gold Partners. We have a Xamarin team, so like Xamarin Forms and other mobile app development, and an Umbraco team. And we're also very active in the identity server space. So we're actually identity server support partners for Europe. I've been working with Umbraco for probably about, I was trying to think this earlier, maybe 10 years or whenever it first came out, basically. And I've just always loved it, gone back to it. And you probably recognize me from multiple events. So yeah. It's quite a whirlwind talk, so we're going to have to go through quite a lot of things to get a taste of the whole process. We're going to be talking about content first, so how I actually data modeled the entire domain of using a real-life example. Then I'm going to go into hybrid and headless and non-headless approaches for Umbraco CMS. We're also going to talk about cross-platform companion apps, so give you a bit of info in case you're not too familiar in that space, what they are and how we worked with them. And then I'm going to talk about the process of combining the two teams. So how did that go? What did we do to make that easier? So project management, testing, talking about hosting, so hosting the app, hosting the Umbraco side, and then basically how we handled having to update the application as well. So the example I'm going to use is a history festival. So there's a city in UK called Gloucester. Don't know if anyone's familiar with it. Yeah. They have an annual history festival where you basically go around, you see tours of all these old buildings, there's brewery tours, various things. Some famous people, so like Tony Robinson has done talk there, Dan Snow. So we were kind of commissioned to build a website for them in order for them to manage their events and add events via Umbraco, search for events, and so on. But the interesting thing for us alongside this build, so it's an Umbraco CMS website. We also built them a companion app alongside it. So this was in 2017. We've actually just refreshed it for this year, which has just been. So I'm going to talk to you about how that went and what we did. So yeah, it was all built on Umbraco, as you're all familiar with, hopefully. The thing I really love about Umbraco, and it was touched on earlier in the chat you had, is the fact it's so extensible, flexible. You're not kind of constrained by the way they want you to do things. You can have your own custom doc types and content. So the fact that we were using Umbraco meant we had a lot of flexibility to do things our way, and this really helped make the companion app and Umbraco a success. Okay, so is anyone working in content first right now? And is anyone kind of familiar with it or wants to know about it? So content first is the process of, traditionally you would do the design and then you'd put the content in afterwards and then you do the development. Content first, you start with the content, so you model everything in that space and then you come up with, you might want to capture it as a specification of those content models. That then drives the design, so we work kind of a different way than usual. It's kind of similar if you're used to code-first terminology. So you come up with your domain-driven design, and there's a good book by Eric Frost about this. You come up with a domain space, and then you turn that into code. So you could do code first, and then your database gets created after it. This is a similar way of working in Umbraco. You create the content model, and then you build up from that. And the thing with Headless CMS, it naturally leads to a content-first approach because you essentially have the CMS and the structure in the back office that then guides the process of coming up with what you need from that CMS up front. So I'm going to be talking about content models quite a lot. what are they? So they're a formal representation of a content item and the relationships associated with it. So when you think in Umbraco, you have a content node. So for example, you might have an event node. That's an actual content model. It's got an event and all the attributes associated with it. And one of the main points, so there's someone called Cleve Gibbon who is, if you're interested in content first and content modeling, he is really, really good expert on this sort of thing. So if you look him up, he's got this phrase, mine, define, and refine. So essentially, you mine the content. So you basically find out what you want to know about that whole domain that you're working in. You then define the content further, so you turn it into more of a structured content model. And then you just keep refining, auditing, adding more and more detail. And throughout that process, you should end up with some really good structured specification for the content you're building. So who should be involved in this process? Basically, everyone. Everyone's got a piece of this. If you think about people that are going to be using the system, they'll want to know how it's inputted. The stakeholders, the various business, so marketing, the developers. In this process of doing the actual modeling, you should just have as many people as you can get involved as possible, because ultimately, getting this content structure right up front, you need to involve many people as possible to give their angle on how they want things to be. So if you imagine a domain universe, so this is actually a business domain that you're working in. So I mentioned Gloucester History Festival. That domain is the domain of a festival, and what we actually do is we model everything we can think of about this domain up front. So you don't go into too much detail at first, you just kind of go everything that comes to your head, basically, what you want to know about that. So that's what we're actually going to do today, a mini example of how that would work. So don't overthink it. You just kind of come up with the first things you think of from any aspect. And I just really like this 404 page from Slack. It's kind of a crazy world, and it could involve anything. So think about your domain universe as this kind of random world. You don't have to overanalyze things at this stage. So time for a bit of audience participation, which I always get really scared when people say that. So I'm not going to do anything too cruel. What we want to do is just think about a festival. So it could be this festival. Just come up with some words the first thing that you think of when you think of a festival. Beer, yeah. Fun, yeah. Venue. Music. What was that, sorry? Yeah. And you could think of other things like, location and so on. Okay, so that would be a process you would do in a room with, maybe you'd lay everything out on the table, or there's lots of different ways of doing this, whatever works for you and your team. And we did this process, and we came up with, some similar things. We've got drinks and events, music, it could be bands, then the litter that gets generated afterwards, portaloos, there could be loads of things that come to mind. So what you then do is you would then zoom in on on these ones that you wanted to keep. So you might go through the process of going, okay, we don't need to worry about music because it's not a music festival and so on. You then zoom in, so we'll zoom in on the event side of a festival. We really start thinking in detail here. So again, just shout out anything you think of when you think of the word event. Date and time. Location, yeah. One more? Name, yeah, brilliant. Okay, so you would come up with everything in detail. We also had duration, capacity, so you would have a limited capacity, attendees and crowds and so on. So you're really now building up the detail, starting to zoom in on these different components. And another really important thing that you mustn't forget is the relationships between these things. So the kind of the taxonomy of these objects. So if you ever did a really like computer programming where you learnt your first object-oriented approach, you might remember you had like bicycle and spokes analogy, or moon and planets. So how these things associate with each other. So it could be you have one-to-many relationships, or something is a type of another thing. It's basically like you do with code, just building up that formalized relationships between these objects. And you can draw these out using your preferred approach. We do some UML modeling, but you could just sketch these out at this stage. Just make sure it's captured, and everyone then approves that these are the things we're going to be modeling. So I came up with a quick one for this festival. We've got the event itself is held at this location, and it's held on this date, and you would have maybe a user group is associated with it, and then the type of event would be a meetup or a festival type. So as you can see, it's very similar to if you're used to modeling things in C#, coming up with your domain models there. And then what we do in Umbraco World is we take these domain models and we formalize them into content types. So if you're used to creating doc types in the back office, you could then go and say, okay, I know I want a location, but what's a location going to represent to me? So for us, it was latitude, longitude using TerraType, with Jonathan Richards there. Basically, so an event has that stored as a lat long. You could say, what do I want the date time to be? What format do I want? Get some really specific detail down. And remember, this approach is all before you've even started coding or designing. Okay, so who saw Matt and Lee's talk? Yeah, a couple of people. So at Code Garden this year, they talked about Atomic Design. So, sorry, it's Mark and Lee, not Matt and Lee. It's a process that's coined by someone called Brad Frost, and you basically take your scientific approach about things. So you split things down into their most low-level components. So something would be an atom at its lowest level, so that would be what you'd consider to be a doc-type property. Then you could have multiple ones of these, so they would perhaps be a composition. Mark and Lee went really far with this. I think they had polymers and petri dishes as well. Organism, which would be the document types, and then templates and pages is exactly what we're used to. And this is actually a formalized approach of coming up with a language to talk about. So everyone then has a shared common language. It's very sort of scientific. We've started using this in our one of our builds at Rock Solid Knowledge, where we split things into folders for these areas as well, so everything should, in theory, be organized into places that you understand. Now, it works for us. I'm not sure if it's not necessarily something you have to do, but it's just another way of formalizing the approach of content modeling. And you can read more about it on the links I'll put up at the end. Okay, so why content first then? Well, now we start to understand and become more in control of the domain we're working in. So we're more comfortable with the event space as a whole. One of the things I really like about web development is I get to see a load of areas that I may not normally be familiar with. So, I could suddenly learn about a cat sanctuary and know all about cats, or if I was doing a website for a brewery, I'd be in the brewery space. And this is something I really like, is that you get to know the domain really well. People have a shared domain language, so you saw the people that would be involved in the process earlier. We're all talking the same language, whether it's developers or UX side of things or the marketing team, because we've all gone through that process, so it's all formalized and we understand what we're talking about. So you could have cross-platform repurposing. Now we know what we're building, so I'll talk a bit more later on, but basically we understand the content, so however you serve up this content, we've already done that process, so we can serve it up really efficiently. And you can ask for the copy in advance. So I don't know if you've ever had the experience of lorem ipsum, it doesn't really cut it sometimes. It might be you go and actually put the real content in and it looks nothing, doesn't fill the space, or it doesn't look anything like you expected. So you can start the process of getting copy up front because you know what fields you can put in, and there's various sites you can use to help that process. And then you don't have to wait until the end and wait for the client to enter all their content, which can delay things or cause problems. It also helps show issues earlier on. Say, okay, we haven't thought of this thing or that thing, because as the client is doing the content early, you can actually help evolve the product a bit more, especially if you're working in an agile approach. And then translations as well, so you've got the copy in advance. You don't have to spend ages then trying to find out what you want translated, because you know already what you've built. And personalization, so we touched upon this earlier in terms of, it's not in Umbraco as such, but in terms of other CMS like Sitecore, you could then start to personalize your approaches across different content channels. So IMDb, for example, or Netflix, they start to build up a picture of you and your preferences based on all your content choices across all different channels. And then doing the content up front is a better editing experience and a lot less time when it actually comes to deploying the website, because the content's already there. And finally, you can actually start prototyping a wireframe up front. So there's loads of different ways of doing this. We use Balsamic, or you could literally just start using other tools that you prefer. But because we've got the content, we can start outputting it straight away before the design process. And then you can essentially see what the structure is that you're building. When your designers come to integrate with it, it's just, you've already got the dynamic placeholders on the views. It's so much easier to integrate together. Yeah, so there's a couple of other tools. I have tried Fabricator, and there's ones where, so YAML, the markup language, where you can actually have the structure already in place and you build up a prototype website very quickly based on this. So you might be thinking, okay, so how does this really help my companion app? So one of the things we do at Rock Solid Knowledge is we build up an actual specification of this once we've built it. So we do it in a document, but you could use something like Swagger for if you have like an API to use. So we start to structure, when I ask for a list of events, I want these events to be this JSON model. So we have on there, we have the API URL, we have the response we expect, we have the JSON objects, and this is all formalized and shared amongst the team. So whether you're working in the mobile space or the web space, we're all working to the same specification. So just kind of rewinding a little bit, just talk about CMS generally. So what I'm more typically used to working with in a non-headless way. Everything is kind of baked in. So you have the CMS itself, and then you have, that's all encapsulated in its code. Then you have the website and the views and the database. So everything's kind of baked in together when you get this. It's normally got some really complex access control. That's one of the advantages. You can set permissions to the levels you want, and some really nice drag and drop UIs and so on. And often you can have translation management out of the box. So that's just a really simple diagram of what a traditional website would be. So you'd have your CMS database at the bottom there, and then your content-driven website. The thing is, as you can see, everything's quite tightly coupled together. And from coding principles, we know that's not a good thing. But basically what you do get is a lot of knowledge, a lot of developers available out of the box. We know how to do this. And everything's just ready to go and roll out very quickly. So the typical workflow, you would add and edit content to the CMS, save and publish, and then your views would be updated based on these dynamic placeholders. But we are in the age of headless now, so we're starting to think and see so many different content channels, really. So we have AR, like VR, chatbots, help, guidance, text, kiosks. If you think of all the places where content is used is actually the word omni-channel, sort of kind of a marketing term. We have to have a shift of thinking. So we're not just building for web anymore. We're not just building responsive apps either. We've got Alexas and so on, and any company would want a consistent message across each device, regardless of what experience the user was having. So I don't want to go onto one device and have a totally different message than I would on a different device, because it causes confusion about the brand, and a lot of companies like MailChimp put a lot of effort into their branding, their tone and their content. So Headless CMS, as a definition, is actually from Wikipedia. It's a back-end only, and the content is accessible via a RESTful API for display on any device. So you are chopping the head off the actual website side of things. It's all just available via an API. So with Umbraco, there is a headless beta currently I'm playing with, and the experience of the back office looks the same, and it's anything you're familiar with, normal Umbraco, you're not going to be confused by. You just don't have as many sections because you don't need the view side of things. And this allows for a separation of concerns, so you can really focus on the content side of things, the CMS side. We don't have to think about how we're going to render this right now. So yeah, Umbraco Cloud would be, there's two things: platform as a service, where you just have some cloud hosting for your solution, versus software as a service, where the vendor actually manages that software for you. So with Umbraco Cloud, I've used it for a few projects recently, and I'm actually moving my own website onto that when I get time. But basically, they manage the updates, they roll things out to you. Essentially, they manage all the availability and so on. So you don't have to think about hosting and that sort of thing. So yeah, just thinking about that diagram, what we've done is added an API part in front of the CMS, and then the website calls the API rather than being all baked in like it would be normally. So that's quite a horrible slide, but there's no interference, so you don't have to get involved and worry about, okay, if there's loads of users on the back office, is the performance of the front end going to be effective, and that kind of thing. It's a nice separation of concerns. So going back to what we did for Gloucester History Festival, we didn't use Umbraco Headless. This is 2017. What we actually did was we used the Umbraco CMS to build the website itself, and then we put our own content API layer in front of that. So then we called that API from the mobile application. So I don't know if this is a formal term. I think it is. It's hybrid CMS is what we call it. And just going back to that diagram again, you've got similar to the headless way of doing things, but the content-driven website calls the CMS database, and our custom API sits in front of it as well. And then the native application calls our API. We could also do it, some places do, I know, where you have everything calls an API to render things to the view. But for us, we only needed it for the application. It's quite a simple website. So that's a kind of summary of the way our setup looks. And so this meant we have two development teams. So we've got the experience now of how we're going to work together to build this, to make sure the companion application works for us, and the website has similar functionality. So has anyone ever developed on Xamarin Forms here? Yeah. So we do that at Rock Solid Knowledge. We work with Xamarin Forms. We have started looking into other ones as well, more interpreted languages, but for us, Xamarin Forms really, really works. And so we had a really small development team on this. It's just Chris. So I'm not a mobile app developer, but I have had a look at the code, and I'm trying to get more into that space as well. So Chris was doing the actual application. Myself and a few others were doing the website and the content build. So I've talked about the phrase companion app quite a lot. So what is a companion app? Well, when you want to have an application, it's something that is sort of friends with the website, sits alongside it, it's very familiar, but it probably has some functionality that you wouldn't get as easily on the website. And more lately, things are becoming able to be kind of cross-purpose, so some location techniques can be used to find directions now, but essentially a companion app that sits alongside the website, helps the process, but it lets you do more than you possibly would on a website. The companion app, it needs to really belong to the site. So you can actually go and download the Gloucester History Festival app if you want to. It's finished now, but you could see that actually we've got the same branding, we've got very similar look and feel. We have different colours for the different types of events. So we've got like a pink for the Heritage Open Days. That's also consistent in our companion application. And the way we did this was we created multiple feeds. So we have a branding feed, which is where it has all the logo, the color palettes, and the colors that we wanted for each event type. So when Chris goes and requests for his Xamarin app the branding, we know he's going to get everything consistently as per the website. And on the other space, the website would then have a logo that is come straight from Umbraco as well. So that really helped us get some consistency and the feeling that when you hit the application, you really belong to that website. And another thing for a companion app is we wanted to have shared sense of functionality. So there's a new feature we brought out this year, which is reviewing events. You can do that on the website. You can also do that on the companion app itself. So you wouldn't have this jolting feeling of, oh, this is really different experience from the website. We have a similar way of showing an individual event. It looks different from a design perspective, but it's sort of similar components. So our goals for this, we wanted a native look and feel for the app, relevant form factors, so whichever device you're on, it works as it should. One of the major things as well is in Gloucester and various old buildings, you're quite often going to lose data. And people, the last thing you want is when you're trying to find an event that you've got no data, you don't know where it is and you're late. So having things available offline was very important for us. We wanted to utilize notifications, so we know from Umbraco what time the event's happening, so then we could get a notification saying, right, you need to get to this place to make the event on time. And we wanted to use location-based information. So Gloucester's not a huge city, but still finding your way around can be tricky, and you just want to have everything available in one place. So we wanted to have our latitude and longitude of every location for each event in Gloucester History Festival. And we also wanted it to be available on both iOS and Android. So when we first created this, so progressive web apps wasn't quite there for us in 2017. It didn't do quite enough of the things that we wanted it to. I think since then, Chris has informed me that's evolved a lot more, so there are more options available to you. But for us, that wasn't an approach we did. We did Xamarin Forms, and we built a native application using an extremely small team. And we managed to get it from conception to the App Store within a month to both app stores. So yeah, we are going to have a look at a bit of code. I don't know how easy it will be to see on the screen, but I'll talk through it as well. And just to give you an overview of Xamarin Forms itself, you can actually write it in the code in C# and it all compiles down to the native language itself. So you get the same framework that you would get if you were coding purely, if you're used to coding as a developer on Android all the time or iOS. The stuff you build in Xamarin Forms compiles down. and you have this XML UI layer, which is called XAML. So this is where you just write in one place, you write the components you want. So you want a label or a button or a trigger. You use the same language regardless of the platform, and it gets rendered to that appropriate platform. So for us, it's great. We all work in C#. We can share our skills across different departments. So more and more, some of the mobile dev team are coming in and doing some web stuff, and vice versa. It means we can all follow the same coding practices, and basically we can do unit tests and that kind of thing. So yeah, we like using Xamarin Forms, but there are lots of other options available. And I know Unity has a similar thing where it's C# and you can write in the same code that you're normally comfortable with. So I mentioned earlier how important it was to have a spec for your API. And I think this was probably the key in how we managed to get everything finished successfully within a month. Basically, we could start development without holding up the mobile team. So we all knew what API we're going to expect. Chris could then go off and build his code using some stubbed out data, because he knows ultimately what he's going to get back. So we developed content first to this specification, and so Chris ran it test-driven development as well. So he basically made sure he had a full suite of tests. Before he wrote any code, he would write a test, red, green, refactor. It's something we didn't do TDD for the website build. We didn't have much logic in it either, but we did have some unit tests for the search functionality. And yeah, Lars is really great, and Anthony from Cogworks, they did a unit testing workshop in 2017 in Code Garden. So that really helped us in terms of coming up with an approach for being able to unit test Umbraco side of things. But basically what it meant was Chris just did his thing, we did our thing, and then we got to the end, and genuinely, because he knew what data to expect, there was no issue when we actually switched it on and started getting real data from the API, because he knew what JSON he was going to be getting anyway. So this is kind of a view of how it worked in Xamarin Forms app. So we had a festival session, which is just for the lifetime of the application. It would keep hold of the information. We then had some different areas. So we had several different data stores, and we had a repository. So Chris used the command pattern and created repositories to get the data. Then we had our client API, which is the Umbraco web API written in C#. And then underneath it all, that's the Umbraco CMS. So yeah, essentially, with the application, it has its own data store. So because he didn't want to keep having to go and hit Umbraco to get information back. So it uses something called SQLite, which can go, depending on the application, it's the same code base. It's another .NET library. So Chris did that, and he just injected the dependency that he wanted, so he could have the same code to access the data store. So this is just to show you a bit of code that's actually the content API. What we did was we have an events feed object, and we pass in a date time so that we can say the content that we want from this date time. This content fetcher is actually, it's a wrapper around the normal Umbraco helper. So it's our own class that wraps the helper, and it has an interface, and it just makes unit testing a lot easier. We then go, so this way of doing things is, you probably would use Xamarin for something more heavy, but this was just to basically go, get me all the content at the root for this event, get the collection of events that you want from this date time. So that update date at the bottom, that's the update date in Umbraco, where you just say when it was last saved or published. So that just pulls back a list of basically content items from Umbraco. And our actual HTTP API call was this events response. So we just created a HTTP response message, and we just tried to get the events feed from a certain date time, because we don't want all the events all the time. We only needed some from the last time the application called this. Now, you might say, there's other ways of doing it, so we didn't use webhooks or anything, but next time I think we would. But because it's such a light use of application, we don't have that many users, to be honest, so we didn't have to worry about heavy load. But what we would probably do next time would be have something where the app subscribes and says, has anything changed since I last called this? And then if it has changed, then you would go and request the changes. But this, for us, it was fine. The application kept hold of its date time from when it last requested things. Quite often it would just call it and nothing would come back because nothing's changed. Yeah, so, I mean, you'll have the slides afterwards if you want to have a closer look at this stuff. You can't really see much here, but it's just to show you this is the Xamarin Forms C# code, so it is very familiar space. What Chris is doing is basically getting the event item and just parsing it as he needs to, based on what he gets back from our API layer. So what we wanted the events to be preloaded and available offline. What we don't want to do is annoy the user and drain their battery and basically constantly be pulling data, because they would just hate that. So what we did to mitigate this was we had another thread which was actually going off and getting the data with an active spinning indicator, so the user knows that things are being pulled back, but they can still carry on using the application as normal because they are on a different thread to actually get the data. And then as data arrives, then it would be displayed. So in terms of staying relevant, so like I said, we wanted to make sure you don't want to turn up to an event and it's sold out, or the location has changed and that kind of thing. So how do we mitigate that? Very important for an events application. And so what Chris did was he did this asynchronously in the background. I don't know how many people manually stop their apps, because I only found out how to do that recently, sadly. But basically, we didn't want to just get the data every time you started the app. We wanted this to happen asynchronously. So he has this periodic trigger, which is an hourly trigger just to do the check. So he basically sent in the timestamp that you saw in the code sample and then got the data back. Okay, so in terms of other functionality, one thing we really like is the location functionality, which basically, using Xamarin Forms, we can write the same bit of code and it just uses the platform-specific functionality. So we just use this Xamarin map control, and then it compiles to the framework application that it wants. So it uses it for Android and iOS. And this means that you can actually utilize the native, so you've got offline maps. Quite often you see Google is updating your map data, and the device the whole time it can have these maps offline. So the user loses data, they've still got the location on their device. And this was, again, using a common interface, dependency injection. So we actually used some code to get the distance to the event as well. So for your favorite events, it would say, you're now, you need to leave now because it takes you 3 hours to get there. And again, the code to do this was basically it called our web API to say, get me the distance to this location, and we would do the calculation and return it to the application to say it's going to take this long to get there. So yeah, probably best to look at that more close up later. Okay, so I mentioned before, so we don't just do Xamarin Forms, we've also had a play with NativeScript lately. So what we have is this, it's called 10% time. We're allowed to spend 10% of time in work on non-business things, just as long as we've told people what we're doing. We can just have play, try something, maybe it won't work out, but having this time has been brilliant for us because we've actually ended up building applications that are going to be sold for real, and that wasn't the intention originally. So one of the things we're looking at the moment is native script. So we're building, it's basically using TypeScript, and it's another way of building a mobile application. I'm not very familiar with it yet, because part of the thing is learning and sharing across the teams. So what I'm going to hope to do is by the time I next do this talk, so I'm doing it in Amsterdam and UK Fest, I hope that I will have be a bit further along and have an example. In that I am using the Umbraco Headless Node client, so that's been good as well. So yeah, hopefully if you see me at another talk, hopefully I'll have more to say about that one. So in terms of more general things to bear in mind when you're working across multiple teams, how we keep things in sync. So there's several areas that we need to think about. What do we do if the app needs updating, which it did because they changed the logo and the branding this year? Well, one of the advantages of having everything in Umbraco is we don't need to republish it to the App Store every time things change, because basically the branding feed gets updated. So all Chris had to do was change the logo, the app icon logo. Everything else was just updated because the branding feed had changes in it. So it really minimized the amount of updates we needed to do and the amount of deployments and waiting time Chris had for the App Store, because a lot of the time content was published and he didn't even have to think about it. So if there are ever any hot fixes, he has a continuous suite of tests, and I did accidentally break one thing, but his tests, and he soon told me about it, and then very quickly fixed it, and then that got deployed without him really needing to know anything. We have a staging environment where he could point the application to locally to test before it actually went on to live. What else? So there's updates, and then we had, in terms of project management, so we would do this differently again this time. We were on separate teams, so it was just Chris. He worked in a Kanban style, pulled things off the board. The only thing that was shared was the fact that we had the same product owner, so he was keeping on top of what the app was going to do and look like and so on, and Chris was just creating tasks for himself and moving them along. Whereas on the website team, we did Agile, and we had sprint planning and various boards. We worked in a Scrum approach. Next time, I think we would all be on the same team, all the same Scrum build in terms of features. So we would have, like the events review feature came in this year, we would probably say, okay, it's a vertical slice through everything we need to do to get this feature out. So Chris would be on the same Scrum. It just would save time. So that was a learning from this project. And then testing. So it really helped, and that was a genuine experience to see how important these full suite of tests were for Chris and ourselves. Yeah, and one of the things I would say is, overall, if you start off with this content modeling approach, just because you can get a CMS off the shelf and spun up very quickly, doesn't mean you shouldn't follow your usual best practice coding. So we always try and follow the usual principles, but so we do work for TDD, test-driven development, keep it simple, stupid, which I think sounds a bit harsh now I say it out loud. But yeah, don't overthink things. We didn't include features just for the sake of it, and we try to keep our code as clean as possible and self-documenting. Solid, so the solid principles. I've mentioned dependency injection. So if you're familiar with that, we actually did inject the dependency we needed into the code. It just means we can swap things out a lot more quickly. Everything was strongly typed because we used the models builder, which basically creates classes from Umbraco doc types, and that means that we knew what the objects were in advance, and the models were generated matched what it got in Umbraco. Yeah, and just basically reusing functionality that you need. So the logo was used in multiple places, but it's only in one place in the branding feed. So in terms of the CMS itself, following the same principles you would for coding, I think is really important. And I did write an article about this if you want to read more about that, which went on to Scrift. Okay, yes, so we're at 2 o'clock now. So just to recap, it's a bit of a whirlwind tour of what we've covered. But we concept modeled a domain universe. We then went through what's non-headless, headless, and the hybrid approach for CMS. You've seen the C# Web API that we actually used, and how this data was consumed via the cross-platform native application. And then you've just had a bit of a discussion about how I found the collaboration experience on both teams and the real issues that we came across and how we mitigated them. So you can't see it at all, but there is a reading list here of other links. Trust me, it's there. Yeah. So yeah, you can have a look at that when you get the slides. And but yeah, Xamarin Universities, if you're interested in the Xamarin Forms side, Cleve Gibbon for content modeling, and there's some other handy links there. So does anyone have any questions about any part of it?
Most of our clients don't know about what content they want until very late in the game. How do you deal with a situation like that?
So I think the process of domain modeling the universe in advance would help drive out those kind of questions. So we even did it for an internal site we're building at the moment. Yeah, there's some heated debate about what consists of this, what does this domain, is this important to our domain, is this not important? So I think that driving it out in advance helps start the questions and the process rolling. And then if you've created a content model, then it does help drive the client knowing what content they should enter, because it's basically been defined up front. So I think if you try this process with them, it drives out a lot of the questions early on in the process and helps the rest of the application as well. So I think it's a case of just trying it out, really, and documenting some of the questions that come out of it from the client. So yeah, content first, it's a different way of thinking, and we've sort of started doing it in our own internal project, where we use Balsamiq Cloud, and they actually go in and write their content into the wireframe directly. So that's one way of doing things, and they start to see the site they're building, asking the questions and up front as well. So you could try that as well. You could also just have Umbraco open for them to start entering content early. That starts the ball rolling and driving out some of the questions. You could just output it vanilla if you haven't finished the design process.
I have a question about continuous integration and continuous deployment of Xamarin app. Did you use App Center or other tools? And the second question, did you develop on Mac or Windows if it comes to Xamarin development?
So we did use App Center because basically the people that were testing it, Chris just gives permission for their device to have the application downloaded onto it early. And we did do continuous integration as well, because every time there was a build, all the tests ran. So we followed our usual process there. And the second question was, oh yeah, Chris has got a MacBook. Yeah, doesn't mean you have to use that. For the native script project, I'm running an Android emulator. It's just whatever your comfort zone is, really.
So for this project, you created your own web API, right? Yeah. But you've also tried Umbraco Headless. Can you talk a bit about the difference or the advantages, disadvantages to those two things?
For us, it's the fact we could craft our own API and have that all spec'd out in advance. That was really useful. But I think because Umbraco Headless was not around, I don't think it was out in 2017, or it was just mentioned. So it just wasn't an option at the time. But now, having played with it more, I think the next project we would probably use Headless, and then by next talk I'll have more experience of what comes back from it, because right now it's just kind of a proof of concept. But in terms of, you can have control of your own code if you have your own web API, but then you lose out on a lot of things like cloud has content delivery networks, and it might handle the stability a bit better. So it's very much the thing of, do you like to roll everything yourself, or do you want to use software as a service? So by next time, I'm going to spend some 10% time. It's all gone on this at the moment, so I haven't had time. But then I will definitely be able to answer that. Anyone else? Okay, that's that. Thank you.